Welcome to this Autism Ontario webinar, where we pose the question, don't we already do inclusion? My name is Matthew Lay, and as always, I will be your host. With me today is Paula Kluth, consultant, teacher, author, advocate, independent scholar, who works with teachers and families to provide inclusive opportunities for students with disabilities and to create more responsive and engaging school experiences for all learners. Paula has been with us before, but it's a pleasure to welcome her back to the Autism Ontario webinar desk. Thanks for being here, Paula.
Thank you for having me. I'm delighted to actually not just to be here, but after quite a year, but to get to revisit this topic, something so near and dear to me. So thank you.
Perfect. Before we get there, let me just give some instructions to our audience. So first off, you know my job, guys, is to get you answers to your questions. Submit those questions in the Ask a Question box right here below me, and I will aspire to get Paula to answer those. We have loaded up the handout section full of valuable resources that relate to the topic. We'll be referencing them throughout the presentation, but you can check those out, download them, or save them to your computer. And as always, if you have any problems with the technology or anything like that, you can click on the help button and someone will be able to assist you, or pop a note in the Q&A and someone will get back with you. So with all that out of the way, Paula, it's time to dive in just a little bit. There was one term that I did not reference in your bio. Your bio is quite long. You have a lot of experience, but it was a term called inclusion facilitator. So this was a role that you held. It was a role I had personally not heard of. Can you tell me what an inclusion facilitator does within the framework of a school system?
Yeah, I would love to talk about the role of inclusion facilitator. Different schools have different ways of talking about what special educators, the traditional role of the special educator and what they're doing. But one of the things that, that really struck me when I first heard that title, and when I first heard it was when I was applying for jobs. So clearly it made an impact. I came out of a schooling experience where I had been educated in not only the legal framework around inclusive education, but the related practices. And I was looking for that kind of job. But I'm 51 years old. And at that time, in the early 1990s, at least where I lived in the States, it was not easy to find a school who was doing the work of inclusion, much less putting their shingle out and saying, this is who we want to be. So right. Even though, different schools, I'm not necessarily saying that if you want to have an inclusive school, you have to use the language or title of inclusion facilitator. Different schools have different ways of handling that, and they have a rationale talking about their own frameworks and so on. But I do think it highlights, with your question, you highlight something that's very important, which is that language matters and that how we talk about our schools and our structures matter. And I have talked to many a superintendent and directors and principals about this idea of, if you really want to be inclusive, you have to put out that, I say like the bat call, the bat signal to people and let them know that this is what you wish to do. And it can do two things. It can not only, internally, it starts a conversation about identity that, it's what we can do to start educating our families, our community. But I think it can also bring people to us. And it did that happen to me. And I'll just tell one other little quick story about I wrote a piece about, I was on a website, looking at a website one day of a school district, and they had amazing language around inclusion. They had described that they were an inclusive district. Here's what it means. Here's what it looks like. And it was just really progressive. So I wrote about that in a book and I put it in a presentation. And a couple of months later, I was presenting and somebody stood up in the audience and said, that's my school district. Like, you're featuring my school page. And I said, oh my gosh, that's great. She was the director, so I assumed she wrote the language. And she said, I didn't write that, but it's the reason I took the job. And she went into this big discussion about how they really use language, how they're very out in front about their philosophy, because even though it may, cause some disruption at times, she said, it really helps people to say, do I want to commit to this and stay? And further than that, it's helped them pull a lot of folks into their community.
It's interesting you say that. We had a lawyer on, I would say, I'm not sure how long ago, but when we did, we're talking about inclusionary hiring practices and the laws in Ontario as it relates to that. And one of the fringe benefits she had mentioned about it, and we're seeing evidence of it right here, was just what it gets you from an overall recruitment possibilities pool. People see that, and whether they've been touched by those, with disabilities or whatever it might be, or just want to work for a company that thinks like them, they're gravitated towards it. And that's two really good examples of it. I'm going to let you jump into your content, but you had mentioned that you're excited to revisit this topic because we have gone through this, I think it was a couple years ago. What's changed? The world, we know, has completely changed with the pandemic. But what's changed as it relates to inclusion that will either be featured in this update or something that you've noted as you've been doing this work, I guess now from home over the past year, but you've been doing this work during the pandemic?
Yeah, I think so. Inclusion's always evolving, right? So this is never ending in some ways, right? Some of the ways in which inclusion changes, some of those things actually stay steady. And so what I mean by that is research will always evolve. And in the case of inclusion, it keeps pushing us in the same direction, showing us all the benefits of inclusion. But we have more of it now to suggest how powerful inclusion is for kids without disabilities, and even kids with the most complex support needs. So we get more evidence over time. The other thing that I think has changed even since I've been here, is that we have more individuals with disabilities taking over in the field in the best ways. They're taking over to correct what we've been doing wrong. They're taking on, in leadership roles. They are, really helping to shape the research agenda. And I think a lot of that has been because of new opportunity. And just this, just a general conversation more broadly about nothing about us without us, kind of a mantra of the disability rights movement. And then technology changes. And that's something that always shifts the conversation. And so this last year with COVID, something I think that's really evolving is that teachers, and we're going to talk about this a little bit, it's becoming more aware to everybody how some of the accommodations that folks have been pushing for a long time are really beneficial for lots of people. So I use the example a lot of times of captions, or something that people have been pushing for a long time. And during virtual instruction, captions were especially useful because your technology breaks up a little bit. Sometimes the audio is not that easy to hear. So that's one example. But folks are seeing, giving kids, a lot of teachers had to give lots of choices last year. Just because, this child's not in front of me, I better work on self-determination skills, those kinds of things. So I think that we're starting to understand and really embrace the universal design aspects of inclusion and of supporting and teaching all kids. And that's all those things are a plus in the advocacy column for those that are really, cheerleaders, if you will, for the work in inclusive education.
Excellent. Okay. It's one of the things that you brought it up last time, and it's weird that in my space it affects it too, but you brought up captions, not last time in the pre-interview, but for so long, we would never use automated captions in the webinar business. Too many people were afraid of the fact that automated captions, wouldn't work that well. And although they have gotten better, they're still not perfect. But what we saw through the pandemic as things were exploding and needing to reach, larger audiences, is people are like, hey, it's better than not having it. And we've seen that in the medical space. We've seen it in education. We've seen all these things that, would have been, 2 to 3 year technology transformation projects happen in the cadence of months or weeks. It's been very interesting to see. And now they're not going anywhere. They're going to be part of what we do. All right. So at this point, I'm going to let you sort of dive into the presentation. Everyone, I've seen some great comments and the like, but I'm going to hold off on asking questions until we jump in. So if you wouldn't mind just showing me you're good to move to the next slide there, Paula. And there you go. And I will throw it over to you, but I'll be here listening along and you'll see me jump in not too long.
Okay. Thank you so much. So I thought I would just start with kind of where we left off in that discussion about, what is evolving and changing in inclusive education. And so I usually start this presentation by talking about some of the questions that I had when I started writing this, engaging in this project, which is a book project and some work that I do with schools around the same title or name. And that's because I kept going to places and probably sometimes, in jest as well, but people would say, don't we already do this? Kind of like you again, you're back. But because of some of the things that I've just shared, we are never quite arriving. This is a process. Inclusion is the work that we do as things, even if we got everything just sort of nailed into place as we liked it, we would have more shifts in what was available in curriculum instruction, the research would be ever shifting and so on. So that's part of it. But the other reason I'm interested in this is because we often are operating, in this space of inclusion with really different understandings of what inclusion is. And so I wanted to talk about and write about, what is a difference between your version of inclusion and maybe my version of inclusion. And I was seeing in particular that a lot of schools that were inclusive by name and doing a lot of wonderful things, that still needed to, continue down that road of expanding practices and changing and evolving and really questioning a lot of the norms, practices, rituals, structures around them. So the example I always give is that I was visiting a school, talking to a principal at an inclusive school. And as I was standing there talking to her, all the kids were arriving and playing on the playground, having fun together. And as we were talking, so a bus pulled up, specialized transportation, and about 7 kids with disabilities got off of that bus. And as each child got off of the bus, they were all sort of escorted into the building, which was unusual to me because, it was a little bit odd because everybody else was still on the playground getting ready for the day, socializing, connecting. And so that really struck me. And it started a conversation that still continues to this day in some way, shape, or form, which was let's evolve, let's assess all of these, even maybe minor kinds of rituals in the school to make sure that they're not more special than they need to be. And what we found for these kids is those kids had just typically always gotten off the bus and gone in early. And when I asked why, I was told, well, they go in early to get set up. So what is getting set up? And it turns out that maybe one student needed to get a picture schedule ready and one student needed to, maybe took them longer to eat breakfast or something. But that kind of ritual or norm I'd seen so many times that I thought it was worth just taking a look at it. And what we found, in fact, was that a few kids did need to go in early to get set up, but that it was not a norm or ritual that every student needed to go in early to get set up, that it had just been done for one. And so we just decided, well, we'll give everybody a little extra time. And so I always implore folks to think about that. When you think you're giving a great benefit, you always want a great benefit that you're only giving to students with disabilities or that you're giving to all kids without individualizing. You always want to ask yourself, is this more special or customized than it needs to be? And B, what am I taking away from a person? And I would argue and did that for those kids on that bus, which happen to be the kids in the school with the most significant communication and social needs, for instance, that those 10 minutes on the playground were more important than anything else that they might need with this extra time that really wasn't designated for any particular kind of support. And we see that happen all the time. We're going to do this for this group of kids. This group of kids is going to be in this program versus thinking about services. We're putting kids in programs. So I always say, whenever you make those kinds of decisions whenever they all do anything. You take the I out of the IEP, you take the personalization out of the support. So that was one scene that stayed with me. Another is just that just constant conversation about, I was in a school district where they were always funneling kids into programs. He's in this program. He's in the Stepping Stone program. He's in this, functional skill. And so kids were going into these placements where there was sort of a conversation about certain kinds of supports that would happen in those programs without individually thinking about what that student may need. Does that student even need social skills support just because he has this label? And so kids were kind of getting put into these boxes instead of really thought about as individuals. In one school, another thing that brought me to this was I was in a school where all students with disabilities, as they were starting to evolve their model, all of the students with disabilities started their day in a space called the inclusion room. So I think it goes without saying, but if your inclusive school has an inclusion room, you don't have an inclusive school. So those were all little stories that I started collecting. And this presentation is sort of my response to those stories and started me asking the question, don't we already do inclusion? Yes. In most cases, we're doing it in lots of places, but let's really make sure it's as pure and powerful as possible.
So I had a question about that. It's just, resonated with me. I have, my son was designated gifted in the Ontario school system. And it was a really interesting designation because I don't know if it's lack of funding or if they just changed it, but he's in the classroom with a few extra assists, but he goes out, I think it's like 4 or 5 times a semester, maybe less semester, to work collaboratively in these group settings. We were talking about it with a friend who is an educator, works at the board, and one of those teachers you wish your children got growing up, and he said, yeah, but isn't it silly that you have to get on a bus and go there to do that? Wouldn't it be ideal if it all happened in your classroom? If your personal classroom teacher was strong enough to be able to handle that. So when I think of the word inclusion, I think about, we have this in Ontario, the idea of trying to keep all kids in the same classroom. I think that seems to feel like it's the best inclusionary tactic. But clearly, there are some scenarios where to practice proper inclusion and to provide, what's needed, you have to bring people to a special place with a person who has the skills. As a general feeling, where are your thoughts on that? Should it all happen in one classroom, or do you understand the need to move out of that classroom and go to the inclusion room, for a lack of a better term?
Yeah, so I think a lot of schools are thinking about enrichment in the same way. Inclusive schools are thinking about enrichment in the same way, I think, in the best of circumstances. The problem, there are lots of issues around kids leaving for any kind of service or support. And one of them is that in those kinds of models, giftedness is a thing that belongs to some students and not to others. And so when we take enrichment out of the classroom, we don't just lose those students and they might miss out on some of that important curriculum instruction, but we lose opportunities for other individuals that aren't so identified to maybe identify some of their giftedness, when we bring in interesting problems to solve, or we bring in some of those same kinds of strategies into general education experiences. So I don't think it's easy to do in either case, but what a lot of folks are doing is just like we would do in special ed with an inclusion facilitator. We would bring in our enrichment specialists, would work in consultation with general ed teachers. There would be co-teaching opportunities. We would do co-design of instruction. We might think about different ways to, get, just like we would in special education, help to let kids, identify certain kinds of goals and competencies that we think are important for learners who we want to help them stretch, and think about who are the adults in our school who can help the students to do that and can help teachers to build their skill set as well. So I think the conversation is very much the same. And there are schools that are doing that, no doubt. And it kind of goes to this next idea in the presentation, which is this is not about, a singular experience, that inclusion is about a process. And it's really about going back to the drawing board, until we we find that perfect storm, so to speak. So I don't think it's easy to do, and I do think it needs a lot of iterations. And just like in special education, there is no set of supports for giftedness, right? Different kinds of kids have different and we know so many students who have, dual diagnosis. We know so many students who they have the kind of giftedness that doesn't show up on typical assessments. So when we bring consultations in with those teachers, we may have students that have a lot of skill or ability in certain units or certain areas of study or certain concepts, but it's not it's not coming up in some of these global ways. And so it may be hard to identify. So we really need those professionals inside the classroom to give us hints about how to support all kids, because that's highly motivating. And it can really it can really be helpful in changing the way that we think about students and really seeing those nuances. And it's really important. So let's talk about
the process. Let's get in there, because we're getting some big questions coming in here that I think are going to take up some big amount of time. So I'm going to suggest that we jump into the process, and I'll stop interjecting with my own 2 cents here.
Okay, so inclusion as a process is the number one thing that I talk about probably in all of my work. And what this means is that we have to take the emphasis off of the space, right? So I always say inclusion is not a process, it's a place. Inclusion is not about the space, it's about the spirit. It's about the work that we do. And so the story that I always tell about this is about a student that I had back early in my career who had a lot of needs, and it took a long time to figure out how to support this little guy. It was a lot of back and forth. We used flexible seating, but we had to go back and forth to maybe 5 different versions of that, and so on. And we eventually were successful with him. We got a lot of pats on the back for being successful, but it was a lot. There was a lot of hustle involved, kind of that back and forth to the drawing board. And a few years later, we got another student who was equally as challenging, if not more. And we were hearing that that this kid had a lot going on, and that we might want to take a look at at his profile before he came through the doors. But the problem was in the years before, I had sort of been resting on my laurels. People were celebrating my school as an inclusive school, which can be a great thing, but also it can cause you to rest on your laurels. At the beginning of my career, I was scrappier. I was willing to kind of, make some of those adjustments as I went. I understood that I would have to, go through that process. And, we had people visiting our school. I was invited to speak at a conference. My administrator gave me an award. I mean, it was an invented award, but I still loved it. So by the time this second student name came, his name's Frankie, I was kind of feeling myself. And that was a bad thing, because instead of really doing my home visit, instead of really, taking my time to go through the individual supports he might need, I just thought, I know how to do this. I'll bring in flexible seating. I'll get him fidgets. I'll get him fidgets shaped like trains. I'll make sure I have technology in place for him. I'll make sure that I have our, push in from our occupational therapist. And when he came in the door, it was apparent that was not going to work for him. Not only that, they're my paraprofessional staff. They're yelling at me. I'm yelling back at them. What do you want me to do? I'm saying, get him the fidgets shaped like trains. Well, he doesn't like trains. He likes windmills. So get him a generator of some kind. I don't know. He doesn't, get the occupational therapist. We have the occupational therapist. That's not good enough, So as I talk to the speech path, find the guy that's operating the Xerox machine. I don't know, find some support. He wasn't interested in the technology that we had, et cetera. And, it was, now I can look back on it as somewhat comical, but it really emphasized for me, if one student with fill in the blank with Down syndrome, whatever it is, one student with Down syndrome. And that's why we have to always make sure that we are thinking about inclusion in this way. There's an awful lot of kids who, even in districts where there's a lot of support and a lot of energy around this topic, will think, oh, well, we've been doing this for kids for a long time. We know how to do it. And we put those supports in place and are maybe shocked when this student with a little bit more need comes in and things aren't working. And it can be very easy to assume it's the child. The child's really not a candidate. When indeed, I would argue that if you look at, school districts that have been very successful with inclusion, in other words, they have high numbers of kids included, that they are very committed to the work, they're getting the data. What we're finding is that they are embracing this process. They know that when things don't work in those first few iterations, that doesn't mean this child's not a candidate, that could simply be a signal it's time to go back to the drawing board. It may be 3 steps forward, 2 steps back. So my mantra is over, under, around, or through, find a way or make a way. And I'm always really clear about, looking at some of those common mistakes. And the reason I feel like I can speak, really, with some confidence on this is because I've worked with a lot of districts that are doing this at really high levels, are getting lots of kids in those doors. And what we're seeing is that what separates folks from, that have the label of inclusion, but aren't getting those high numbers with what separates them from those that are able to really embrace not only the language, but the practices and get the results is that they have an expectation of this process and this rocky road and this journey, if you will. And they understand that even if we are putting in rich supports, even if we're co-teaching, even if we have a paraprofessional sign, that may not be the right mix for this person. So we have to be careful that we're not just providing the real estate of that 8th grade classroom, but not related supports. And that we're not providing this, even if we are providing great supports. I was providing, I think, really high quality supports. They just weren't the right ones for him. So here's this school with this great reputation, and we've got, the technology. We have push-in supports. We have, peer preferred peers. He didn't prefer them, but I had them in place. So we have to experiment with that range. And then I think the other thing that happens and I would say so many kids, at least in the States, and I quite frankly, I know it's the same there, they are at risk of losing their access, their placement, because in some instances, you also see this error that we think, oh, he's not, we included him, but he's not catching up. We included him, but he's not at grade level. We included him. He's nowhere near where the other kids are, thinking that means that she is not a candidate. And that is not true. Inclusion does not mean that kids have to engage, perform, engage with the same materials, have the same outcomes. Kids need to be able to meet their individual standards in that space. And they're going to be accessing general ed curriculum and instruction, but they don't have to have the same exact targets. They don't have to be responsible for all of that curriculum. They may be accessing different kinds of, supports. They may be different kinds of personal support or even different kinds of assistive tech. But it will be different for every student, even every student with the same general kind of profile. So one of the ways I operationalize this for educators is I have these little 20 ways lists on my website. And they are not, amazing where you would never see this content anywhere else. I think most teachers could do this in 10 minutes. It's more of an exercise, if you will. So I have one called 20 Ways to Adapt the Read Aloud. I have one called 20 Ways to Adapt the Science Lab. And they're just structures. They're just little exercises that teachers can sort of lay on top of a structure. I always say that kids are not elastic. They don't have a lot of give, if you're trying to pull on them, so to speak. But structures can have elasticity. So this is really about saying, how do we make common structures like read aloud, circuit training and physical education, morning meeting, Socratic seminar? How do we add elasticity? And so I always say there's got to be at least 20 ways to do this so that when kids come into the classroom with a really unique learning profile, I don't have to keep adjusting what guided reading looks like. We can just maybe, even if it's just mentally, look to our 20 ways list and say, there's more than one way to come at supporting all kids in this structure. So that might be an easier way of understanding it. But that's what process means. If these first things don't, work, go back to the drawing board and reconfigure what those supports may look like. And for a lot of kids, the first couple of weeks of school are not going to be fantastic. And maybe the next few, we're going to make really incremental and slower progress. But the good news is on the other side of this is that we often end up stronger in our skill set and better able to support a wider range of needs in the school or classroom. So that's number one. And it's probably the biggest message that I have for you. But one that I often pair with it is about the entire school, the entire community. And that is, we want to consider how to broaden our lens. And this is something that has really evolved in the last, I would say 20 years at least, is a much bigger focus on the benefits for all kids. We are no longer concerned about 10% of our students, 20%. It would not be responsible for me to say that is the thrust of my work. I'm really concerned about a rising tide in all ships. How do we use these related practices to really help all kids be successful? So, I sometimes talk about this in terms of how do we use this in terms of universal design, where I'm going to talk about that in just a bit, actually, but also affectively, how do we just create a great community? Like, I love this picture of a shared weighted snake, that it's just a great example of what we bring in for some, can actually be a helpful benefit for all or for many. And so we want to build a community where there's lots of supports available for all kids. We want to build a community where difference is really typical and even celebrated, acknowledged. And we also want to make sure that we are building schools that will help teachers to think a little bit differently about their practice in all the best ways. So I'm going to share a little video clip of a principal that I worked with a few years ago. His name's John Price. And every single year that John Price was a principal in Chicago Public Schools, his test scores went up. And he ended up winning this big blue ribbon award for closing his achievement or his opportunity gap between groups of students. And he talked about inclusion every time he was asked a question by a reporter. And yes, he was interviewed for the paper, getting these awards. And he would talk about inclusion. He said this catalyst for these changes was inclusivity, was thinking about redesigning school for all. So we're just going to hear him talk about that a little bit.
I think in an inclusive classroom, when you have teachers who lead the class through conversations about what's right for one student may not be right for another student, what one student is working on is not necessarily what you need to be working on, when respect for all is part of the conversation, when a child needs to have a conversation with their teacher about, well, why is he allowed to sit in a chair and I have to sit on the rug? I think when you have a classroom where those conversations are part of the learning, I think that what you get is that children understand themselves in a much more sophisticated way. When everyone is expected to do the same thing, either you succeed or you fail. I think when you broaden the definition of what success looks like, ways and provide many multiple pathways towards proficiency and excellence, the kids get to see, well, maybe I'm not, it's not just success or failure, but I'm not good at paying attention when somebody's talking to me, but gosh, I really am good at paying attention when there's text in front of me that I can read. Gosh, if I can just squeeze something in my hand, I can do it. They find out a lot more about themselves when they compare, and when kids are allowed to do those kinds of things, when you've got a kid next to you who has a really hard time writing, you realize, wow, I've got this really special gift. I can write. I can write with both hands. I can type on the computer. And so I think kids learn more about themselves, and that's part of our vision, is that students will learn about and understand their own passions and gifts for learning. And when there's one way to learn, when there's one book that you got to read, kids don't get to learn that lesson about themselves. And I think that for me is what kids get out of an inclusive classroom. I think
that John had an opportunity with me to to probably talk about his test scores and talk about some of those academic benefits. And, you know, when I put the camera on him, that he said something else was really interesting to me. That he wanted to talk about design, essentially.
Yeah, it was interesting, and I'm sure not common at the time. When I look at the fidelity of that video and the like a unique perspective for sure was being stated there. And every time I'm on this desk, oftentimes we're hearing from psychologists, you know, ABA professionals, speech pathologists, whatever it might be. They talk about ways of interacting with children. And as a parent, I always think that sounds just like good parenting. That just seems to make sense to me. And, you know, stuff that I can always take and move into my life. And what I'm hearing is a broad correlation between, you know, these inclusionary steps in the classroom and what it means to every student. And that was echoed by one of our viewers here. I do have a question before you move on, and it's worded in an incredible way, which I think is awesome. And I'd like to ask it of you. And this comes from one of our viewers, and they ask, what are 5 more things we can do to include those on the spectrum? 5 more things. I guess that brings a base level of assumption on what's being done already from an inclusionary perspective. But when you think of, you know, the children on the spectrum, what do you think are some things that we can do more, better, whatever it might be, to help include?
Well, I'll try to come up with, these may not be my top 5, but just on the fly. And you're actually going to see some of these things reflected in the next set of slides as well. But I think a lot of my recommendations would be couched in this area of what we call universal design for learning. It's really leaning into things that might be designed initially or thought about for students with autism or other disabilities, I should say, or disabilities, but over time that we have understood the benefits for a much wider range of kids. So one thing I would say is really taking very seriously what we did this year, which is SEL support, so social and emotional learning, and not just responding to students as far as having you know, social skills training, which is such a very you know, it's such a singular and you know, just such a you know, I don't know. It's, I guess the only thing that comes to mind for me is, it's, you know, just kind of sad out there on its own, you know, approach, that we want to think about, something more comprehensive. So, you know, bringing in more community building and teaching kids things like, which we were doing all this year, you know, using guided meditation, teaching kids about breathing, and not just using it in classrooms, but teaching kids to do those things. So SEL is really big. And I think we're now seeing how helpful that can be for all. I think, you know, making sure that we are giving kids, and again, something that happened a lot this year, is we were giving kids a lot of time and space to engage in a lot of agency and choice making. And so I'm going to talk about that in just a second as well. Like, how do we broaden what is considered, you know, appropriate in curriculum and instruction so that students get to have not only more choices here and there about where I'm sitting and what I'm going to do first, but what do I want to learn? And I think we're starting to get there. And I think that will be really profitable for lots of kids I know. And then I think, you know, thinking about spaces as well. So how can we now, as we came in, you know, 6 feet, you know, distance between students, we learned a lot more about kids and some of those needs. And so it's like, hey, can we, you know, what was comfortable for kids this year? What kinds of, you know, what kinds of things do we want to add in place? And one school, for example, I was in, they were saying kids had to keep these distances, and it forced the paraprofessionals to think about how they would space themselves. And so students had a lot less proximal support and were kind of sitting on their own. And that was really working well for lots of kids to not have so much proximal support, to sit closer in groupings with kids and things like that. But just in the environment itself, how do we think differently about, you know, not only the environment and having some choices and what that can look like, but also this idea of personal support, which I think evolves. And then I'll add one last thing, which is I think one thing that really came out of this year that we have to take very seriously is much stronger collaborations with family and home, because teachers got to see into classrooms and classrooms got to see into homes on a regular basis. We have so much data now on one another in the best possible ways. Like one teacher said, I know the grandma so well now. I miss grandma. It's like, use that, right? Or I know how much I love your doggy. And now we can use that. And parents are saying, my child really does well with these math tasks, but it helps when you don't overcrowd him and help him too soon. I notice that he does like to offer ideas, but he likes to draw what his response is first and hold it up. Parents now saw that, what that looks like. So I think those are some practices that, again, maybe more than just my recommendations just came to mind because of the last year, but I think they're all really important. And that brings me to, go ahead. I'm sorry, Matt.
I was just going to say that I've heard a lot about the differences that technology brought us, but not quite as much about that idea of the distance side of it, right? And what that distance has actually given us, especially within this community. And maybe it's because being in Ontario, we've been locked down a lot longer than you all in the United States. We had brief occurrences of getting back to normalcy that were shut down pretty quickly with the third wave. So it might be that we have less experience and can look to what you guys have been doing in the US to learn a little bit about that. But with that, I think that, that question might have stolen some thunder since you're going into some examples. So I'll let you get back to a reminder, everyone. I'll be coming back. So please enter your questions in the spot right below me.
Yeah, I don't think it steals the thunder. I think quite the opposite. It's a great little preview for us. And I think it's a nice reminder here that a lot of those suggestions, well, I always say kids with unique learning profiles are a catalyst for our creativity. And so that was a very helpful preview to say, yes, we want to think about all students. And here we have this slide. What about the other students? So it's actually the perfect time to talk about those 5 ideas. This is a study from a Polish researcher named Sumsky. And if you want the data on what I'm talking about sort of affectively, you see this study emphasized that inclusive schools, students without disabilities, achieve the same or higher grades. We don't see negative impacts, that there's a greater opportunity to have friendships with students with disabilities. And we also have this lovely sort of softer outcome, which is demonstrating an increased acceptance, understanding, and a positive attitude toward inclusion, toward understanding what's possible. So I always think, oh my gosh, the next generation of teachers, this is going to be great because they have a way of thinking about this. And so I always talk about, imagine when we have kids who are starting to understand this a little bit better, all the wonderful benefits that we will have for this next generation. I joke about it being teachers, but also business owners who are less afraid about employing people with disabilities, politicians that have been, educated side by side with folks with, different learning needs and profiles. So all of that to me is always striking. But I also think, as a parent, I just can't imagine not valuing those outcomes. I value all of those outcomes. Academic, sure. But I certainly value that kids grow up in an inclusive school because they live in an inclusive community. So this next recommendation is very much in keeping with what we were just discussing and this question about, well, what would be those 5 things that we need to do? And my mind went to not only the pandemic, but it went to a lot of the work that I do in universal design, which is that a great way to understand inclusion is to actually focus on barriers. And that's what the work of universal design asks us to do. And that's a model that a lot of teachers are using these days to plan lessons, to understand how to organically design experiences that will be inclusive, but also appropriately challenging and interesting. And this is a message that we're hearing a lot. It may be said in different ways, but what I always talk about is, when we focus on these barriers, here we have a cat who is jumping up on the gate and taking the whole thing down. And this is what we want to do in schools, is we want to seek out those barriers and say, okay, let's take down this barrier, and we might not just find access for one cat here, but we might find access for others as well. And so everything that I'm going to share with you is just an example of that. It's an example of something that's designed for one, but now has been an inspiration for rethinking some aspect of schooling. So anyone that's on this call that's a teacher absolutely knows that flexible seating is something we saw, 10, 20 years ago, you hardly ever saw any flexible seating. So whether that's exercise balls or little cushions or, could be, a little rubber band tied around the legs of your chair so that kids can bounce their little feet back and forth, have a little fidget. Now I see flexible seating everywhere. You can't go to an elementary school without seeing some examples of flexible seating in, if not all of the rooms, most of the rooms, or at least many of them. That is just something that you see in an elementary school. And you're actually seeing more of it in middle school and, of course, even in high schools. Even if it's not, again, for every student, even if it's not in every classroom, it's something that grew out of a need for certain students. And then teachers saw, oh, this is actually really, it's helpful to provide some of these choices to other kids. And we actually are seeing some nice outcomes as a result of that. And so we are going to try to integrate that even when those 3 students with disabilities I have are no longer in my classroom. And that is true of even things like, communication access and support. So some of you are starting to see these lovely, playground communication boards, right? And some people are using them at their school playground. Some people have them on their childcare community center, kinds of spaces. And they're really great. And of course, they started for students with disabilities. But I'm sure anybody listening to this, watching this, can think of about, 100 other ways to use this. It's used for very young children. You can have Braille on your board, so it can be used for students with low vision. It can be used for students, for a caregiver who's just doesn't know what this small child wants. And so I can go through a list of ideas and brainstorm with that individual. If I speak a different language than my caregiver, this can be helpful for a very shy student, a student who's selectively mute, and I could go on and on. So a lot of communities are putting these in place just because they found that the community used them in new ways once they were offered. This is an example something that I made. The next 3 are actually, I made this during the pandemic for a student with Down syndrome who was having a hard time coming to class and, listening to the teacher when his peers weren't there and so on, and the paraprofessional wasn't there. So we made him a little purposeful fidget, kind of a little adult coloring book. And this was to kind of focus his attention. There's actually some evidence to suggest that students who get shade and color when they're listening may remember more. So we were thinking about that. We were also thinking about highlighting for the teacher, the general ed teacher, some of the most important concepts for the student, as he is not responsible for every concept in each unit, but for some. But it was so successful at him being able to kind of hang in there with virtual instruction that not only did the team make more of these, but they, of course, gave them to every student in the classroom. Other kids are saying, we want that adult's coloring book as a little study tool. And so they were able to provide that for all. So it started for one, and looking at a student with the most needs was that catalyst for creativity. Here's something else that I created in the pandemic, and you can actually go visit it and use it in any way that you like. It is called Virtual Calm Corner, and the web address is www.virtualcalmcorner.com. I was envisioning kids who would no longer have their fidgets at hand during the pandemic. So I created a virtual space. Lots of folks did this. Lots of teachers did this. Lots of schools did these. You can make your own, or you can use mine. But I'm now envisioning something that was created for a few students during a pandemic. I was talking to one teacher, a high school teacher, and she has kids access the site. They come in, she gives them 7 minutes, they put their headphones on, and they can pick anything on the site. So all kids use this after lunch to kind of get centered. And they can pick any aspect of the Calm Corner they want. They can listen to something, they can watch the lava lamp, they can breathe. And that's in the best case scenario, we are using these kinds of tools to give a much broader range of experiences to all students. Consider this last example. This is a tic-tac-toe board that I made, again, during the pandemic, working with a student with a disability. And the teachers were saying, we've never had to offer this much choice because we're not sitting right there, and we have to make sure kids come to class and stay. So that's why I was saying with that question earlier, giving choice and agency, control and power, handing the reins over, all of those things that we had to do in this last year, that's a great practice in general. And so as you can see in this little board, I mean, even though these activities that are used for just one part of a unit in algebra, even though there's only 9 choices, we can further differentiate, you know, in any of these areas. We can give different kids different challenge problems. We can have different kids. We can change our expectations for the kind of problem that they're solving to put up on the Flipgrid. We can even assign them different brain pop videos to watch. We can change our expectations based on what they submit. We can bring different teachers together, like special ed and general ed, to work with students as they are making their way through the choice board, the tic-tac-toe board. I can have kids work in small groups. I can have our speech pathologist in the classroom working on related skills. So a lot of these ideas have this lovely, again, they're designed because, you know, to respond to diversity, but we end up with all these other helpful outcomes.
So just realizing something here. I don't know what's happened to my screen, but we got about 10 minutes left. I wanted to give you a quick sort of time check on that and ask a really interesting question that came in. Do you have any strategies for getting buy-in from educators who are at a different stage in the process of inclusion? i.e. still thinking, you know, more of like this child needs this and this one needs that approach?
Yeah, so a couple of things. One is for getting buy-in for folks who are in different places, it can really help to identify the firecrackers, so to speak, in your district or school and really highlighting them. So we often think about how do I sort of respond to those that aren't there yet. But I think one of the things that we can do that's an easier way to start is say, who is doing it? Let's lift them up. And even if it's just in small ways. So I always say, identify those firecrackers and identify those, I want to say, lighthouse teachers who are really making things happen. And today, you know, with the video camera in our pocket, you know, grab snips of what's happening in classrooms. In one school district I'm working in, they grab little mini examples of inclusive practice, and they have a shared, you know, space on their, you know, it's like kind of like an internal website where any student teacher, any teacher across departments can kind of take a look at that. And instead of learning from just outside sources like me, they can be learning from folks inside. And even if that's just a small pod of folks in the beginning, that's a really helpful resource for growing what's already happening. So hold up those that are doing it. And the other thing is, you know, a lot of times when I have folks that, you know, aren't maybe resisting, I always think, you know, are they really understanding the task? And sometimes it's that I'm not really, and I'll give an example of that with inclusion as a process, is I think sometimes teachers may not understand that students can have those different objectives. They may not understand that the success will look different for that individual. So if all they see when they look out is that this child is still behind, that motivation is going to drop. So I always say one way of addressing folks that aren't enthusiastic is help them to be successful. At least, you know, that works at least from the inside, right? Help them to be successful. And that can work a little bit from the outside too. So my briefest answer, just with time as a limitation here, is that even as a parent, I've seen that help, that idea work. My friend has a little website that uses social media, and every time a great support is put in place for her child, she'll broadcast that. She'll tag the teacher. She'll say, look at this great adaptation. Look at this great support. And she always gives feedback constantly and saying, you don't know, my child actually understands the circulatory system. Look what's happening. My child's never talked this much at home. He's actually reading this Encyclopedia Brown book. That kind of constant feedback can be really helpful because some teachers don't understand. They think success is catching up. And if we're not really clear about what success looks like for an individual, and again, I know maybe I'm being a little generous here, but I often do see that sometimes the struggle comes from not really understanding what, what achievement can look like for that individual. And so we really have to be clear. I've seen some teachers go from completely unmotivated to saying, I did that. Like, okay, now I'm getting it now. I didn't realize he couldn't do that this year. He's actually never couldn't, he really couldn't, he never stayed with a book for 15 minutes before. And I did that. All right, tell me more. So really making sure that there's some clear information about what's that marker. And then one last thing, and I'll be very brief, is just in general, I referenced this in that first slide, is just kind of, is this more special than it needs to be? That is another helpful tenet. And really asking, why are these kids going in early? Those kids are still on the playground. Why are these kids accessing this special extracurricular that's created just for kids with disabilities versus, joining the track team or getting into the school play or those kinds of things. And some of the violators we see I was in one school, the inclusion room, we already talked about that. I was in one school where they had a lunch bunch and they really wanted to show this to me. They were really excited. And it was simply that they had kids with disabilities in one room and they would bring kids without disabilities into a special ed room for lunch every day. And they called it the lunch bunch. And they were really excited about it. The problem was, there were many, but number one, not natural proportions. So you've got, 7 kids with disabilities and 3 peers. So that's not natural proportions. That's not inclusion. Kids with disabilities, not even leaving to go to the lunchroom. So they're not included in the fabric of your inclusive school. It really takes, again, it's back to every time they all do anything, you take away the I in IEP. That these are the only peers that you can have at your lunch table. And then finally, some of you may be familiar with the coffee cart, and this is something I talk about a lot, is be really careful of some of these models. I even look like really alarmed there. But this is a video that you have a link for in your materials, but it's another whole long rant that we couldn't put here, but really this idea that in some schools, especially middle schools and high schools, we've got kids with disabilities full on serving their peers without disabilities, coffee, pastries, and sometimes in the name of inclusion. Hey, we have this coffee cart and it's inclusive because our students with disabilities are, I guess, going down the hallways with a cart in an inclusive school. So it's not, I always say I'm not against coffee, but be very wary of those structures that don't include kids with and without disabilities, that don't connect to standards-based content, and that really fail to look at some of those things like, is this really inclusion? Is this more special? So you can make your coffee cart more inclusive. So you can go and watch that video to learn about it. But it starts with things like natural proportions of kids with and without disabilities, adding in some really great goals related to business education, marketing, whatever that may be, culinary arts. And truly giving kids a choice and voice in participating and how they will engage, in what activities that they want to, engage in that experience. But as it is often conceived, not very inclusive. And for all those reasons, I just want to share kind of this last little point, which is my recommendation always at the end of this is to ask a different question. And that means, all of that to say, everything I've shared is really about saying we need to really flip the equation. We need to flip what's happening here. And what happens a lot here, and I know in Canada too, is that we look for these small bits in the day. Maybe it's even several, but we look for, should we include this kid in math? Should we include the kid in science? Hey, maybe we should, get him in the literacy block, maybe in specials. And we need to take very seriously the reverse of that, which is instead of looking for places in the day to include kids, we need to ask the question, why does she ever have to leave? And to me, that's more important maybe than anything else that I've shared here today.
Well, you took away that ability for me to ask you that big takeaway question right there. Why do they always have to leave? Why would they always have to leave? So we're rounding it out. We've gotten to just about the end. You did reference that video is in the handout section along with a link to your website and a few other items. But just very quickly before we wrap up, you keep citing all the stuff on the website, but what can people gain by visiting the website? What kind of things do you have there?
Yeah, so on the website, there's a lot of these materials that can either be used personally or in your own professional development. So there's video, there's there's a lot of articles, short articles. There's like a tip of the day there, and some reading. So definitely check it out, because you shouldn't have to buy a book, to learn about inclusion. And not only do I have lots of free resources, but there are a lot of free resources from Autism Ontario, et cetera. And things that are really bite-sized for any stakeholder.
Well, with that, I don't think I've ever seen so many comments in the question feed today. So a lot of people in agreement with you and a lot of what you're saying, and very appreciative of your time that was put together on this presentation. And with that, we must bid adieu. So thank you so much for your time. Thank you all for joining us. A reminder, this webinar will be available on demand on the Autism Ontario website at some point tomorrow. If you know anyone, a family member, loved one, teacher, educator, person next door who might find benefit in this, please pass along the URL, pass along the link. The more people we get through these webinars, the more webinars we are able to put on. And with that, I want to thank everyone and say I will see you next time on our next Autism Ontario event.
Thanks, everybody.